I'm Jack Brewer, and this is the Wayward Sons Book Group with special guest James Carrion, a longtime writer and researcher with a special interest in UFO events of the 1946-47 time frame. I'm also joined by a group with a diverse range of perspectives and opinions on those events, including Erica Lukes, the executive director of Expanding Frontiers Research. Thanks for being here tonight,
I
Erica.
am so happy to be with you. And I've watched every week. I've been glued to it and I've learned so much. And I love the exchange that each of you, or all the ideas that each of you brings to the table. It's really been informative for my work. So thank you.
Thank you. And we're joined as well by a longtime friend of the program and supporter. You know him as Fringe Quest on social media, Mr. Michael Redmond. Thanks for being here, Michael.
Well, it's great to be with you all, Jack.
I'm also joined by the Wayward Sons Book Group regulars, Rachel, Allison, Stephen, Brian, Randy, Jeff, and Sharon. Thank you all for being here. I look forward for your comments and opinions. I encourage those to be expressed. Learn more about Expanding Frontiers Research at expandingfrontiersresearch.org, as well as our Patreon, and follow our account on Blue Sky. You will find all of those links in the YouTube video description. James Carrion is a former intelligence analyst in the U.S. Army and former international director of the Mutual UFO Network. He earned a master's in international studies and bachelor's in Russian language at Florida State University. His research, including his 2018 nonfiction book, The Roswell Deception, and his 2025 paper, Flying Saucers, an Opening Salvo of the Cold War, explore the likelihood key alleged UFO events during the 1946-47 timeframe were orchestrated and exploited by select members of the intelligence community. Thus, the overlap with the Wayward Sons Book Group and frequent reference to James's research. Purposes of the 1946-47 exploitation of the UFO topic, as proposed by James, included deciphering the Soviet diplomatic code via an intelligence community technique known as gardening. And I'm sure we'll be discussing this and much more this evening. Thanks so much for joining us, James.
Thank you, Jack, and thanks to everyone who has also joined. I really appreciate it. I've actually been watching your videos as well weekly, and every time I get that invite link, I want to join, and then something comes up, whether it's work or something else. So I'm sorry, this is my first appearance on the show. I've been dying to join you guys and discuss not just my research, but discuss Jack's research, just because he has done excellent work in this field. Jack and I and Erica, and I'm sure most of you are probably kindred spirits. We are critical thinkers. And that's what's important. I think that's what's missing in this entire subject is a heavy dosage of skepticism and critical thinking. And funny, because I had a reporter from New York who called me the other day and said, why are you putting videos up on YouTube now? I thought you were out of the UFO field. And my answer to him was, truly it's because we are getting inundated right now throughout all the media by the disclosure movement. Everything happening in Congress, everything being pushed from the top down, the whistleblowers, the congressmen who are alleging crash retrievals and alien bodies and all of the stuff that we know, those of us who have been in the UFO field for a long time know, because a lot of it we've heard before, and a lot of it's myth, and it's being recycled now very heavily. Not sure why, but bottom line is that's what the public is being exposed to on a grand scale. And I guess I just couldn't stomach to keep seeing that and being inundated with that without having to provide a counter argument, which is what I've long believed, that if you want to look for a common thread throughout all UFO history, it's going to be human deception. And that's really what this 12-part series I've started with 4 episodes initially, and still have another 8 to go. It's to document all of the human deception. This is not lore, this is not mythology, this is documented, where someone in the intelligence field or various agencies have meddled, basically to put out mythology, to create myths. And so I really wanted to document that, so that there's a counter argument, so that the common man, when they're trying to understand what the hell is going on with all of this disclosure, they can see that there's another side to it.
Thank you. Yes, I will link to James's YouTube channel in the video description. And one of the things that I particularly appreciate about the videos is that he asserts that he's not trying to teach people what to believe, but teach people how to think. And I appreciate that. And as a research organization, I appreciate the methodology as well, that he presents a data point and then he attempts to qualify whether it supports a certain hypothesis or disqualifies a certain hypothesis, or may do neither. And that's where I think a lot of us get into trouble in debating, is we can agree on facts, but we get bogged down in what those facts indicate. And so I really appreciate the methodology of trying to systematically go through these points that might be revealed through FBI memos and other authenticated documents, and then try to identify where that makes any given hypothesis stand. So I appreciate that approach, James.
Thank you.
So we're familiar with your paper, the 2025 paper. Some of us are familiar with the Roswell Deception. We've also been looking at your videos this week. Is there a general statement or something you would like to say about your overall stance on the summer of 47 to get us started?
Based on my research, I am absolutely convinced that, based on evidence that I've examined, that this was a Cold War operation, that what came out of it is a myth. What came out of it was something that America adopted as mythology, but in effect was essentially the Allies at the time, which were the British and the US. They were conducting deception operations against the Russians for very specific purposes. And those are all outlined in the book. But I think that, if we want to explain the anomalies of 1946 and the anomalies of 1947, if we want to look on the paranormal side of it, sure, you can say, yeah, those were aliens coming, and those, ghost rockets over Sweden were extraterrestrial devices, and the same thing over Roswell or over the US in the summer of 47. And so that's what the proponents, the ET proponents, want you to believe. And that's their hypothesis. I have an entirely different hypothesis that is based in the world of reality here, which is that there's always a precedence to something, nothing new under the sun. So if you look at it from the point of view of as a historian, especially if a forensic historian, What you're looking for are things that stick out, that are anomalous, and trying to understand those, not from a paranormal perspective, but from a mundane human perspective.
Yes, thank you. Are there any opening, anything anyone would like to ask about yet, or about James's confidence in his conclusions about the summer of 47?
This isn't, can I not say a question but raise a point? Is that okay?
Sure.
Okay. I mean, I think the main issue I have is that I don't think there's really any UFT. There's no unified field theory, especially when it comes to looking at the subject from an anthropological perspective, because we have the Forteans, you know, there were contactees who were already doing that sort of stuff before. And, you know, there was a lot of stuff going on in the culture that can't be explained by intelligence operations. So I think that it's quite plausible that some of this stuff was orchestrated, but I find it really hard to believe that the US military orchestrated the whole flying saucer era.
And I would agree with that because they didn't have to. They just had to take advantage of what was already out there and use the parts and pieces that gave them advantage in whatever their operation was. And I think that's probably one of the issues I have, or I think what my critics have issue with me is they're basically saying, oh, come on, you can't explain everything that's UFOs with that theory. I'm not trying to. I'm trying to very much explicitly try to understand what happened in 1946 over Sweden and what happened in the saucer summer of 47, starting with Kenneth Arnold sighting all the way up to Maury Island. Those are the discrete time frames that I say smells like an intelligence operation. Anything else is fair game. Could be extraterrestrial, could be interdimensional, could be paranormal. I can't put a label on it, but I can tell you specifically for those events, based on the research I've done, going to the National Archives, finding original documents, finding a coherent operation that was taking place at that time that could explain it, and then putting a hypothesis behind it. Focus specifically in those areas and that time frame. So I think one of the issues that ufology has is they want to take this bucket approach, throw every UFO sighting into a bucket. And if you can't explain everything in the bucket, well, then your hypothesis is no good. That doesn't make sense. It's kind of like they want to, be an archaeologist and just go dig up a site with a backhoe, throw it into one big pile, and then try to understand the history of that site. You can't do that, right? Archaeologists stratify. They go through carefully, layer by layer, right? Decade by decade. And so if you look at things discretely, if you look at operations discretely, which is what I've done in my 2 books, I'm not trying to explain the whole subject or all activity. I'm just trying to explain those specific things. Because if that can be proven, well, that tells you a lot, because those are some of the foundations of ufology, right?
I think another thing, though, is that like what you're talking about, these are intelligence operations, so they're not connected with the creation of mythology. For example, with Roswell, you're talking about Roswell being used for counterintelligence, and Roswell didn't really gain any mythological significance until the 1970s, when Charles Berlitz and I want to say Stanton Friedman wrote that book about Roswell.
Yeah, Bill Moore. No, I'm not saying that that's when the mythology started. I think the mythology was created by the UFO community based on what they were seeing, right?
Okay, I misunderstood. Okay, I thought you were saying that the mythology was orchestrated. Okay.
No,
Thanks.
I don't think when they kicked off these Cold War operations, they even thought that the general public would put an alien label on it. I think that just happened organically, and they just ran with it. Like, oh, great, well that'll help us along here. You know, we don't even have to try to explain this. You know, we just have to let the public take it and let them, you know, basically make it go viral of their own accord.
Thank you. Thanks for your patience with my questions or
No,
my
no,
points.
any questions? I
So-
appreciate your questions. Thank you.
So that-
Yeah, I encourage that. I'll tell you that just a personal anecdote here. From reading work like James's, I've come to look completely differently at newspapers. Like, I used to kind of look at them as a collection of things writers presented that the public needed to know. And then I got to where I'd look at them more as like an intelligence briefing for adversarial intelligence agencies. And that's written by American intelligence agencies. And like when you look at a statement from a DOD spokesperson or from a CIA spokesperson has informed a writer and given them this statement, it would be like the public is collateral damage and not the target of that statement. So that any mythology, if I'm understanding correctly, and just my perspective, may or may not come and is kind of indifferent to the office that's giving that statement if it's targeting a foreign adversary is the purpose of publishing the statement in the first place. Which kind of brings me to, there are some key points in James's research that those data points that I think are difficult to dismiss, that for a hypothesis to be correct, it needs to take all of the key data points into consideration and explain them. And as we've discovered in Wayward Sons, a lot of the stuff can't be explained and we don't know the purpose. And the UFO community infamously omits that. Like I would bet even the Kenneth Arnold sighting itself, if you ask the average person that may be pretty well versed on UFO stories, may not know about the circumstances at the hotel. The typical narration just starts with this man named Kenneth Arnold was minding his own business, flying along, and look what he saw. Why would he lie? And that in itself shows that not only does an intelligence agency not need dozens or hundreds of writers to do their bidding, just a couple of key planted stories, because other people will willingly do it for them. They will willingly omit the details that they don't like and they don't want to fit. And then, if I'm understanding correctly, the purpose becomes for the gardening. Could you tell us some about gardening, James, and how that worked?
Yeah, and I'll take one step back here.
Sure.
So before I even thought about this whole gardening hypothesis, what I was looking for was the infrastructure of an intelligence operation. So back in 2013 timeframe, I went to the National Archives because I was looking for something that would tell me if there are intelligence operatives or intelligence personnel or government personnel behind the 46 ghost rockets and the 47 saucers, who would those folks be? And as I started digging, that's when I found the key people that I detail in my book that actually were in operation during the entire time of both operations. And they were actually there for the pure purpose of deception. And they also had a side job of code breaking. So when I started to look at those two things and put them together, that's when I came up with this gardening hypothesis. But I think we need to go back to something that the CIA put out in one of their online documents, where they talk specifically about the history of signals intelligence in the CIA. Now, remember, the CIA wasn't founded until 47, right? And prior to that, it was the Central Intelligence Group. And what we're seeing is that in April of 1947, even before they were officially the CIA, the Central Intelligence Group, along with the key Army counterintelligence person and the key Navy counterintelligence person, those three agencies formed what was called JCIC, the Joint Counterintelligence Center. And it was based on Nebraska Avenue, where the Navy had their code-breaking operation, and specifically for the purpose of counterintelligence based on code breaking. Counterintelligence based on code breaking. Now, interesting. So that's what started me on the whole journey of, well, what is that relationship? How is counterintelligence? How does that relate to code breaking? And that's where this whole gardening hypothesis came from. So if we look back at that history, what we were concerned about was how heavily the US was being infiltrated by the Russians. We knew in 46 that the Russians had infiltrated the Manhattan Project. We were concerned that they had infiltrated other parts of our government. And so if we know that there are bad people out there that are infiltrating us, how do we uncover those people? How do we figure out who they are? Well, that's where the whole Venona project started, where we figured out that there was a flaw in the Soviet diplomatic code, because the Soviets used this code to transmit messages from the US and all of their other stations around the world back to Moscow Central. And because of the way the communications worked back then, they were forced to use commercial telegraph carriers. They were forced to use RCA, Western Union, ITT. And so what they would do is they would encrypt their messages, take them down to the local commercial office and send them, because they were confident that their code was unbreakable, which if they had properly used it, is absolutely unbreakable. Even today, you cannot take a quantum computer and put it against a true one-time pad system, which is what the Russians were using back then, and break it. It's absolutely mathematically impossible. So that's why they were so confident in the fact that they didn't have their own way of communicating back to Moscow, but they had these commercial carriers that would take the messages for them. And then lo and behold, the US Army figured out that there was a flaw in their system, because they didn't properly follow a one-time pad system the way it should be, which is you create one pair of a pad, and then once you use a pad page to encrypt a message, you destroy it and never use it again. Well, they screwed that up because during the war, they created multiple pairs of the same pads, and then they distributed them to all their centers around the world. And then the Army was able, and the Navy were able to figure out, hey, we have a message coming from, let's say, Australia to Moscow, that used the same one-time pad that was being sent from Washington to Moscow. And when they can compare those two together, they could break that code, or they could try to break the code, because there was multiple layers to the code. And really, the only way they could break the code was they would have to have something called collateral, which is basically some guesses into what the message could have there, whether it's a crib of, if it's Soviet trade traffic, you knew that all Soviet trade messages started with the same preamble, so you could sort of guess what the underlying code groups were. But for everything else, they didn't have that. And then they learned from the British, and also we learned from our own experience at Midway, the best way to create your own cribs is to do gardening, which is to get your enemy to take text that you suspect that they're going to know and they're going to use, get them to encrypt that, so you could use that as collateral against the other messages that had true intelligence value. So that's, in a sense, what gardening is. But I didn't really tie it into the whole operation of UFOs until I found that there was this joint counterintelligence center that married counterintelligence with code breaking. And the same people that were involved in that were also the people that were involved in deception. So that's when I could come together and sort of put together the coherent structure of what existed back there with real people in a real organization, not just making things up out of the blue. There's a real organization here, and trying to understand how that all fitted. That's where the hypothesis was born.
Yes, I can appreciate that. That part of my research for Wayward Sons, I went into it with the idea that I don't have anything to write and nothing to add if I can't identify the names of CIA officers and the offices they work in, that it's not just they, the CIA kind of thing. And another point that I feel like in your work demands addressing in order to dismiss your hypothesis is Project SEAL. I mean, you established, irregardless of what happened with Ghost Rockets, Kenneth Arnold, or anyone else, that Project SEAL was a deception operation misrepresented to the press. And it's significant for a few reasons. If you wouldn't mind summarizing that, I'd appreciate it as well.
Sure. Yeah, and what astounds me is that historians, just normal everyday historians, don't look back at that time frame and look at those newspaper articles and say, what the hell is this? How do we explain that? And if they can't explain it, why do they just set it aside? Right? Those are the anomalies I'm referring to. So let me sort of give you the lowdown on what Project SEAL was. So if you look back, because I spent a lot of time looking back at old newspaper articles from 1947 and 1946. And the one thing that stuck out to me was that 2 weeks before Kenneth Arnold had his sighting, there was a story that went viral around the world, which was basically that the US, the Allies, the British and the US, had a top secret weapon that was even greater than the atomic bomb. Now, what could be greater than an atomic bomb, right? Well, obviously today, there was nothing back then that was greater than the atomic bomb. But what did the public think that was? And was there any basis in fact there? So what I found out was that in the numerous articles that you can find in the newspaper around this, that were touting this top secret weapon, they named 2 scientists. One was a New Zealander and one was an American. So these are real people and they were real scientists. So I thought, well, let me find out if there's a real project behind this. So the American, James Carrion Snodgrass, was, before he died, was a professor, used to work at the Scripps Institute of Oceanography. And when he died, all his papers were donated to the Scripps Institute. So I flew there in 2009 because I wanted to see what was in his papers. And lo and behold, what I found was the declassified Project SEAL report. And what Project SEAL was a real top secret project during World War II. It was conducted with the guy from New Zealand. So those are the 2 scientists named in the article. And what they were experimenting on during World War II was how to trigger and create an artificial tsunami with underwater explosives, right? Because that was when we had the war with Japan. So we were getting our asses kicked in the Pacific. And so what we needed was something that before we sent the Marines onto a beachhead, we could trigger a tsunami and just drown all the Japs that were there, right? All the Japanese soldiers that were there on the beach. That was the reason they were doing this experimentation for this Project SEAL. But then in the declassified report, what I found out is that the project only lasted until 1945. And then it died. And no further research was done on Project SEAL. But in 1947, that project was being touted as active and real and greater than the atomic bomb. That is the deception part, purely documented in newspapers with a declassified report to back it up. And again, it astounds me that historians don't look at that and draw the same conclusions. That, come on, there's got to be something there that was deception related. So, and here's the thing. The New Zealander was also an expert in aerodynamics. And so what happened is when the press got a hold of that, they speculated that this new top secret weapon that was greater than the atomic bomb was an airborne weapon. This is 2 weeks before the first flying saucer sighting. And you guys can draw the conclusions, right? If you're Stalin and you're sitting in Soviet Russia looking at these articles about a new top secret Allied weapon that could possibly be airborne. And then 2 weeks later, now there's all of a sudden these sightings around the US about this flying object and nobody knows what it is. The analysts back then in Soviet Russia weren't looking at this as, oh, those must be aliens. They were looking at it as, oh my God, there's a top secret weapon here, possibly airborne. Now there's people seeing these strange things in the skies in the Western United States. What is the relationship between those two? And so that's the target of whatever operation. The target was not the American public. They were just collateral damage in all this. The intelligence target was going to be Soviet Russia.
Any comments, questions?
I was going to add something in here too. So as a plus one back to Rachel too, there's a curious thing that happened in August 1947, where in Michael Sword's work with the UFO History Group, they call this the silence from topside. And this isn't an insight because it's silence. So I don't know what you can make of it. But at some point after the Roswell incident and the Kenneth Arnold incident, there was this kind of indifference that happened. And so I'm just going to leave that as like this mysterious like thread. Maybe you can pull. I'm going to period, next paragraph, and then ask James a question here. Were all gardening opportunities that you're talking about opportunistic, or were any of them planted and planned? Like, were these all like, I think that makes sense, right? Does that question make sense to you, or do I need to expound on that? Like,
I was thinking about that too. Like, did they like it wouldn't necessarily have to be manufactured. Like, they could just target particular stories that are already published that have the words in them that they need. I was thinking about that.
Sure, but I think the important thing to remember here is that if it was truly a gardening operation, whatever they were planting had to be of enough interest that the Soviets would turn around and encrypt it as communication and send it back to Moscow. Not just summarize it or clip it and put it inside of a parcel inside of a diplomatic bag that they would then fly to Moscow. Right? This had to be something that would have to trigger an urgency where they would have to go down to their local commercial carrier and actually take these newspaper articles. I'm not saying verbatim, they could have been translated, but go ahead and put them on the telegraph wires as encrypted communication. That would be the only way the gardening hypothesis works. It would have to be urgent. So what they were doing is they're looking for something that would cause urgency on the behalf of the Soviets. What could be more urgent than the 509th Bomb Group being the one that found this alleged flying saucer at Roswell? The 509th Bomb Group was the only atomic force in the world at the time, at the top of the Soviets' target list. Anything out of Roswell would have been of tremendous urgency to the Soviets.
That's actually another one of my data points that I think require addressing in order to dismiss your hypothesis. Would you please give us a little background on that bomber group and why it may be considered really unusual that they would take a press release to the press at all?
Sure, absolutely. Okay, for a couple, we'll look at it from a couple different perspectives. So let's start with the 509 Bomber Group itself. This was formed out of the Manhattan Project. They were the group that, based at Tinian, delivered the atomic bombs to Hiroshima and Nagasaki. They were also the same group that was part of Operations Crossroads and dropped the atomic bombs and exploded the underwater bomb at Bikini Atoll. So they were born out of the Manhattan Project, and they understood secrecy. They absolutely understood the importance of keeping their mouth shut. So the fact that it was that same group that put out a press release makes, from an intelligence perspective, zero sense. Now, that's one part of it. And I can argue all day with various folks in the UFO field about this because they seem to think that that has no bearing on it, and I differ on that. But let's take it from a different perspective. Before you could put out a press release of that magnitude that may involve information of importance to the enemy, you had to pass it by one organization in the US which happened to fall under the Joint Chiefs of Staff, which happened to be a unit called Joint Security Control.
Yeah.
Which also happened to be the same organization that was responsible for strategic deception against our enemies. So Blanchard, Colonel Blanchard at Roswell Army Airfield would never have put out that press release on his own accord unless he was told to do it. Absolutely.
Agreed. Yeah.
I think it's a really strong argument. I think, yeah.
Fascinating.
And the other thing that I think is interesting too, and I pointed this out in my recent videos, is the fact that the United Press and the Associated Press releases differ. They're not the identical same press release. Why does that make any sense? If you're Colonel Blanchard, you're going to put out a press release. Why not put out the same uniform press release to all of the different press associations? Why did the Associated Press get a different press release than the Associated Press? United and Associated. Doesn't make any sense from a mundane perspective. Makes complete sense from a gardening perspective.
James, can you describe really quick what those differences were? I'd like to go read them, but if you could just summarize quickly what the differences were.
Yeah, they're not, the differences were not huge. They were basically things like, for example, that the whatever the thing they found was flown to a right field versus loaned to right field. Or it was the United Press, I believe, that had a detail that the Associated Press did not. Something about that the object was seen to have a blue light. So they were very small differences because the press releases themselves were not huge. And I think that it was not just the press releases that could have been used in a gardening operation. It would have also been everything that happened after that. The whole balloon detraction that happened 3 hours later. That information also went out over the wires, would also be of urgent interest to the Russians. They could have sent that off as well. So there's a whole corpus of tactics that could have been used that have nothing to do with the original press release. But just there are differences between the press releases.
What's significant for gardening, though, if that were the case?
Significant for gardening, yes. Yeah. Correct.
So if you're here on the Zoom call, you don't have to agree, as James says in his videos. This is his hypothesis. And if you're listening at home, the goal here is that you understand the hypothesis. And it would even be helpful if you understand it to an extent that you can add significant research to it and explain why one data point may actually disqualify a certain aspect of it. But that was something that I thought was important, was if it was a balloon or a test craft or any one of the pretty valid explanations, pretty credible explanations for the Roswell debris field. I even hesitate to call it a crash because I don't think anyone ever reported seeing anything crash. We just know there was a debris field. Does that data point disqualify using the incident as an advantageous press release and gardening tool? Not necessarily. No, it does not.
No, absolutely does not. But you know, what I find interesting, Jack, is that when I first finished my book, The Roswell Deception, which basically has everything A to Z that we're talking about, right? The organizations that I think were involved, the actual people that I think were involved, their military records, the whole, deception operation through Project SEAL and the gardening hypothesis, it's all in there. It's 500 something pages, all documented with clickable links. You can get back to the original source material. And I thought in 2018, when I released that, I'm going to be spending a lot of time debating this with people in the UFO community. And guess what?
No.
Crickets.
Right. Yeah.
Crickets. Not even somebody like Stanton Friedman wanted to debate me on it, which I found astounding.
You left them speechless, James. They were speechless.
Speechless.
Words failed them.
Yeah, the only one who actually tried to counter something was Kevin Randall. And what he did is he put out a blog article and he dismissed all of my research in the book because of one data point he didn't like, which was there was some major, I think his name was named Major Curtin. And I thought it was a certain Major Curtin that I found through historical research, and his historical research that it was some entirely other person. That was the only thing he didn't like. And that's why he dismissed all the research that I did. And I think you'll find that across the board is that the folks that are heavily invested in the extraterrestrial hypothesis, they cannot conceptualize an alternative hypothesis. And if they can't conceptualize it, then they don't want to read it, and they don't want to see if the data behind it is real. And so therefore they don't want to debate it, which is fine. I don't expect, because at this point I'm convinced that ufology is a religion and it's based on faith and based on belief. And you can't counter that with no argument can counter that. So, but then what I found interesting is that, so the ufology community didn't want to debate me. And then, so what am I left with? Perhaps the Cold War, the Cold War historian side of it. Nobody wants to talk about it there either. So I'm sort of stuck in the middle here with a hypothesis that nobody wants to talk to me about. And what I find interesting is that lately, the only person, I don't want to call it a person, that I've been debating with over the last 3 months has been an AI. But here's the key thing about this AI, because I use Claude, Anthropic's Claude, their most recent version, is that it pushes back. It pushes back nonstop. Every data point I give it, oh, did you really think maybe that you're right there? Maybe you should consider this, this, and this. And I appreciate that because it tells me that I could be wrong. And not only could I be wrong, I need to maybe look for more evidence to bolster whatever I think is a good data point. I need more data points. So when the Department of War came out with their recent flood of material, which I am very grateful for a couple of reasons. One, they have lifted the redactions on a number of documents previously released. So now I can compare the old document I had that was redacted to the new document. The copies are much more clear. The scribbles that are on those documents we couldn't make out before, now we can see what they are. And what I find highly interesting is that one of the key personnel from the summer of '47, who was the key counterintelligence guy in the US Army, a guy by the name of Gil Jacobus, his name is on a number of those documents. And it's not that he signed them, it's that all of these saucer stories, it would say, somebody would write in there, please refer this to Gil Jacobus, Military Intelligence Division. Saucer stories being referred to the chief counterintelligence guy, who just happened to be the one that created this joint counterintelligence community center that was trying to do counterintelligence based on code breaking. I'm not saying that confirms my theory, but I think those are data points that help bolster that there's something there. And so those are the things. As more documents get released, the more I can start looking for other things that will corroborate it. Like, for example, the gem that the FBI released about Kenneth Arnold giving his talk at the Boise Ad Club. And I don't know, did you guys look at that video and understand what that
I did, yeah.
Yeah. Well, for those who haven't been able to watch it, let me just sort of explain it. Okay. So Kenneth Arnold was the first UFO witness. Turns out he also was the first ufologist. Because in July of 1947, Ray Palmer, the guy behind Amazing Stories and Fate magazine, wrote to Arnold and said, hey, Arnold, I believe you. And guess what? Somebody else had a sighting like yours 3 days before you did, supposedly, up in Tacoma, Washington. I'll give you $200 if you go up there and you interview these guys, you can get the real story, which was Maury Island, right? That was the whole Maury Island thing. So Kenneth Arnold, he got this letter from Ray Palmer. This guy is a fire extinguisher salesman. He's a private pilot, but that was his business, was to sell fire extinguishers and firefighting equipment, I mean. And so he had doubts about if he was going to, go up to Tacoma and interview, the Maury Island witnesses. So he had these doubts. But it turned out that he gave this talk at the Boise Ad Club where he expressed his doubts about, the offer he got from Palmer. And right after he ended the talk, some man walked up to him and said, hey, those two guys you're going to interview, that Chrisman guy and that Dahl guy, I know them and I can vouch for their reliability. Now, Boise is 500 miles from Tacoma. How did it just happen that this one guy, right, during that time frame, happened to know those two guys who we now know to be charlatans and completely, not reliable, for someone to vouch for them at a time frame when Arnold was undecided? And he actually told the FBI that based on that character witness, he changed his mind. That's what convinced him to go up to Tacoma to investigate Maury Island. So those are the stories. Those are the things that are coming out that have been sort of hidden away in the FBI archives and other archives. And I think maybe, let's see who was on the call. Is Jeff still on the call? Yeah.
Yeah.
I think it was Jeff, you brought it up in a previous discussion with this group where, or maybe it wasn't you, I'm not sure. Someone said about, well, the FBI, weren't they the principal counterintelligence people back then? Shouldn't they have been the ones investigating all this counterintelligence stuff? It's true. That was their job back in 1947. Their job was counterintelligence in the United States.
Yeah.
But they were not behind this deception operation. They were not behind the code breaking. They were a third party to it. And that's why when you read all the memos and all the memorandums that have come out that the FBI released, like for example, around Maury Island, you can see that they have this role that's a non-actor role at this. There's sort of this third party that's come in to this mess of some intelligence operation, and they're doing what the FBI does, which is do their due diligence and interview people and put it on paper and make sure they cross all their T's and dot all their I's. And they did such an excellent job of that. And it's from those memorandum that we can see what's the intelligence pieces or the operatives that were involved there. And I think probably one of the key things had to do with the fact that they were interviewing the Salt Lake witnesses of a UFO sighting that the Salt Lake Tribune, I think, came out and named. And lo and behold, two of the people that were in the newspaper that supposedly had this UFO sighting had never seen a UFO. Somebody had put their names in the paper without their knowledge and without their cognizance, and for whatever reason, they were put in the paper as UFO witnesses when in fact they were no such thing. Now, those are just two witnesses, and it just happened to be in this one FBI memo. How many other hundreds or thousands of UFO witnesses back in the summer of 47 may have had their name in a paper that they had no idea about? Or even if it showed up there, they're like, I don't know how my name showed up there, but who are they going to complain to? Right? And here's the problem though. That's essential data that would bolster my theory, but it's data that's long gone. Right? I can't go back in a time machine in 1947 to interview these people. Right? And the FBI didn't document everything that was happening in that time and all the UFO witnesses. Or maybe they have more data in their files they haven't yet released. But the bottom line being is that we're seeing things that don't make sense from an extraterrestrial point of view, but they make complete mundane sense from a gardening point of view or from a counterintelligence point of view.
If I could interject real quick, I really appreciate your work, James, and I really am I'm growing more fond of your theory as time goes on, and I appreciate you explaining it and taking questions about it. And even with the information that you were talking about right now, as far as a guy coming up to Ken Arnold and saying, those two guys over there, I can vouch for them. It could certainly be the case that was just somebody that, what's his name, Chrisman or Dahl had, given a few bucks to go say that to, because they were trying to entice him down, right? Same thing with people ending up in newspaper stories. Whoever's trying to promote that or push that hoax or whatever could just be throwing in other people in the town to try and bolster the claims.
You're absolutely correct there, Steve. You're absolutely correct. Everything you said is a valid point that I could see it one way, but you could also argue it the other way. And guess what? Claude disagrees with me too, because he pointed out exactly what you pointed out as to another plausibility. So you're absolutely right. I agree with you. I'm not saying that my explanation is the right explanation, but I will add one thing. I hope I didn't. If you had more thoughts, I didn't interrupt you there.
No, please continue.
Okay, I want to talk about William Rhodes. For those who don't know, William Rhodes was this guy based out of Phoenix. He was actually an inventor and electronics buff. And in 1947, he saw a strange object flying overhead in July. He took out a box camera. He took 2 photos of it. And those are the famous Rhodes photos that are showing up now that the FBI released or that came out with the Department of War documents. And what's interesting about that story is that we knew one part of the story, but what we didn't know and wasn't released until these recent FBI memos came out was that his story was being talked up in the press as, oh, the Army and the US government is interested in those photos and it's top secret. It's being discussed as a top secret subject and top secret set of photos. And when he found out that the press was saying that, he was like, wait a minute, how did they come up with that information? I haven't even talked to the Army yet. How is this classified as top secret? So he went to pursue the story to find out who was embellishing his story. And when he talked to the local radio station, he found out through the local radio station that information about his photos being top secret and of great interest to the US came from a United Press release out of Washington. Now you guys got to think about that. This was not a United Press office in Phoenix where he was at. This was not the local newspaper pushing a story from Phoenix. This was the United Press with a press release from Washington that went across all the wires from United Press that says this guy in Phoenix took these top secret photos, or we're considering it top secret. That was his story back then. And that was not being originated locally. That was coming from outside in. And to me, that data point speaks more than even the Boise ad thing or even the witnesses whose names somehow showed up locally in the newspaper in Salt Lake City. That shows that from a central point of view, somebody was pushing a story down that was not true. And I find that highly significant.
And adding top secrecy to it as well.
Adding top secrecy, and then if you look at the documents that were released, they were classified confidential. His photos are classified confidential, not even top secret.
Right. Yeah, I had those as data points. In your video, the 1947 FBI memo documenting that Hughes and Crookston were unable to state how their names ended up in the newspaper as having observed flying saucers, and William Rhodes citing in video that is there any way that you could not interpret that as intelligence community manipulation of the media? Like, how else hypothetically could it happen?
Yeah, I can't think of a real reason for that. But I think you're bringing up a good point, because when we talk about media manipulation, a lot of pushback I've gotten from critics is that, oh, so you're telling me that every newspaper editor was in on it and every reporter was in on it, and they're the ones that the government had, their fingers, and they got all these people to put out these false reports? No, right. That was not required. What they had to do was to get the head honchos of the press associations to buy off. Right. The guy in charge of the United Press, the guy in charge of the Associated Press. And it turns out that those guys who were at that time in 47, 46, were in charge of those news associations. They were highly patriotic folks that had very close relationship with the Secretary of Defense, the first Secretary of Defense, James Forrestal. And James Forrestal, as you can read in historic documentation, was chomping at the bits to use the press to manipulate the press for the purposes of government deception or for the purposes of pushing against the Soviets.
let's remember that we are right in the aftermath of World War II. And during the entire period of the war, the American media and the American government were
tied.
like this.
Yep. Office of War
You know,
Information, Censorship Office, absolutely.
Exactly. In other words, the American media was a war maker, well, a war adjacent to the federal government.
Mhm.
And that kind of mentality, of course, remained for a long time through the Cold War. So I mean, we could roll that right up into Roswell. Now, I don't think the relationships that late were as tight as they were, let's say, in 1947. But in 1947, I dare say anybody who was important in the press already had a relationship with the feds one way or the other. So there's an entirely different attitude going on here. The press back then was disposed, willing to help the government because we had been at war. All right, and now we're facing a scary problem with Moscow, on and on and on. So I mean, this is not at all surprising. But you raised an interesting point that I don't think that people look at too closely, James, which is I value that, which is the fact that counterintelligence is kind of like a platypus within the zoo of American intelligence. Why? Because it's precisely because counterintelligence has been placed in the FBI, which is primarily a law enforcement agency.
Mhm.
I mean, its primary mission is not counterintelligence. Whereas when you look at our allies, take the Brits, for example, with MI5 and MI6, there's intelligence and there's counterintelligence, and they're two separate operations. And you find that kind of thing repeating through our Western allies, the French, et cetera. It all gets very, very crazy because it's possible to argue, and I kind of think the last 40 years proves the point, that the United States has been doing intelligence all wrong for decades, insofar as we do not have a designated counterintelligence operation that is accountable within the system for what it's doing. Everything gets balled up with the FBI and the DOJ, and I'm rambling. But your point, what I would like to see, and what I really appreciated in James' work and the work of other people, is an increased focus by ufologists on the intelligence community. Who are they? What are they? What do they do? Right? What have they done? All right. I see this really missing in pop ufology. All right. Well, of course, a lot is missing from pop ufology, but so anyway, thanks for that, James. It's one of the reasons that I value your work, because you have paid careful attention to those areas, and there aren't that many ufological researchers who have.
And you bring up a good point about the counterintelligence aspect of it, because we have to keep in mind that back in 46 to 47, it was the FBI's job to do counterintelligence. And lo and behold, this other organization that formed between the Central Intelligence Group and the Army and Navy, who were creating this joint counterintelligence center, which they never involved the FBI until much later. And even the code breaking aspect of it with the Army Security Agency, with Project Venona, and Op-20G on the Navy side, also doing code breaking. That was also a counterintelligence aspect to that, because once they figured out, as they started breaking codes, that it was the KGB or MGB back then that was the ones using this diplomatic cipher to send back their communications, and they were naming people that were agents and code names and scientists from the Manhattan Project. They understood from the code breaking that there was a huge counterintelligence aspect to it. Mm-hmm. So we have essentially two different entities in the US government back then, one that was on the code breaking side and counterintelligence, one that was on the FBI side, which had to do more with the mundane side of counterintelligence, right? Surveillance and trying to turn people that were agents. And those guys were they were basically butting heads. I mean, you have to remember the personality of Hoover. Hoover back then was a very jealous guy. He did not want somebody encroaching on his territory, especially counterintelligence. So that's why I think we see, even if you look at the UFO side of this, why we see the Air Force the Army Air Force trying to entice the FBI to start interviewing saucer witnesses, because they knew they couldn't handle the entire investigation side of it, right? They could maybe perform the gardening part of it and try to bring out the information that had to do with agents, but they couldn't turn around and go and interview those folks, other than that Air Defense Command had a standing order for all of their all of their organizational entities in the field to do counterintelligence investigations around UFOs. That's why we see the 4th Army Air Force out of Hamilton Field in California. It was their agents that went up to Portland and to Tacoma to interview Kenneth Arnold and Dick Rankin and E.J. Smith and all of these other witnesses, because we had the Army Air Force pushing a counterintelligence investigation that the FBI itself was not involved in. And so, so we see that, we can see that counterintelligence vein, but we don't see the FBI start doing it until the Army Air Force says, hey guys, you, the FBI, don't you think there's like some, Russian stuff going on here? Maybe you guys would be interested in interviewing these witnesses, because they could be a fifth column, they could be, Russian influence operations, whatever. They had to entice them to join the counterintelligence fight.
And other comments, questions, counter perspectives?
Oh, I have one. I have one short anecdote, which I think James will enjoy. James, I have a 40-year background in newspaper journalism. All right, and I ended up in the 1970s working with Ted Morello. Ted Morello was the UPI reporter at Maury Island.
Oh yeah.
Now at that time, I had no idea. I wasn't really into UFOs or any of that business, but it did come up, and I tried to ask him about it. I said, Ted, this UFO thing that you were involved with, well, he got completely exasperated and wouldn't discuss it. He had nothing to say whatsoever. But what I gather, as we followed up a bit, because I never really got him to open up, but between the governmental authorities, his colleagues, and everybody, Ted didn't want to hear one more word ever about UFOs.
Very interesting.
So I just said to myself, but years later, I said to myself, what are the odds that here I am on the East Coast, right? There's Ted in on the West Coast. Years later, we meet, and I just had to share this. It was just, and Ted's no longer with us. I guess he's dead now, about 20 years, I would think. But he was an amazing guy and an amazing journalist. But as I said, I just had to share this, that I actually knew and spoke to Ted Morello, and he would not open up on this subject. This is the last thing in the world he wanted to talk about.
Interesting.
What a shame. Well,
yeah,
and for those on the call who don't know who Ted Morello is, he was the United Press wireman in Tacoma back in 1947. Yeah. And so he was at the United Press office when this whole Maury Island thing was going down. Yeah. He was the recipient of the anonymous phone calls of somebody who had the inside knowledge of what was happening at the Winthrop Hotel, where Kenneth Arnold and E.J. Smith and Crisman and Dahl and the Air Force guys were talking to each other about UFOs. And then when the two Air Force guys went back to Hamilton Field and their B-25 crashed the next day, he was the recipient of those anonymous phone calls that made the newspaper. So yeah, I mean, that's amazing that you knew Ted.
Yeah.
Thank you. I wish I knew Ted and Paul Lance.
I wish he was still around now. Now is when I would really nail him to the wall. Back then I backed off because also I wasn't really aboard, ufology at that time. But when I heard the story that he was involved with that, I had to ask.
Yeah.
And as he wasn't going, well, let me ask a question. And of course, everybody is free to answer or not answer. Who here believes that they may have had a UFO sighting or experience? There's one, there's two, there's three. All right, that's me. Just curious. All right, just curious. I'm in chatting with Rachel because Rachel has very kindly invited me to do an interview, and I said, okay, I will. I just lost my train of thought. Uh, well, it'll come back.
Take your time. Yeah. Yeah. I have seen something that I don't know what it was in the sky. How unusual do I think that was at this point? I don't know. I thought it was much more unusual when it happened before I found out how infallible eyesight and memory and things like that, or how
Yes,
fallible they are.
fallible.
But any other comments, questions?
Brian,
The thing that I had wanted to say that I had said to Rachel, let me interrupt a minute, is that some of us are in a peculiar position because it's either believers or debunkers. It's like the whole rest of the country is, everything has to be at extremes. Some of us cannot be either. And I'm a case in point. My wife and I did have a UFO experience which was reasonably dramatic. All right. Prior to that, that sighting, neither of us have been particularly involved in any of this business. But it is very isolating because if I speak to the believers, I'm thinking to myself, oh, bullshit. All right. Then I'm talking to the debunkers. And on the basis of talking of my experience, I'm talking to the debunkers and I'm thinking, bullshit. To insist that there's nothing there, well, I know better. What can I say? I don't expect anybody to believe my story or the story or anything. But it's enough for me to know that something very strange is going on, all right, up there.
Yeah, you're absolutely right, and I think that I've spoken at length about this spectrum of belief that you're talking about, with true believers on one side and true debunkers on the other side.
Right.
And the thing that both groups have in common is their minds are made up. There's no convincing them otherwise. So when you're stuck in the middle like I am, because I've heard enough stories from enough reliable people, including my own brother-in-law, who is not going to lie to me, and some very dramatic abduction stories that never made the press. Nobody's looking for fame, and truly dramatic. That I think, yeah, there must be something weird that's happening that people are experiencing. The problem is those real experiences have been hijacked by intelligence operatives who are using it for their own purposes.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
And so they're the ones muddying the waters, and that's the problem, is how do you separate the wheat from the chaff when you have someone manufacturing nonstop mythology around this?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
They've also been hijacked by fanatic believers as
Absolutely.
well.
Absolutely.
Yes.
Now, I'd interrupted Rachel at some point. Wanted to give her the floor back.
Can I add one?
I just wanted
can
to
I add
ask,
just
Brian,
I wanted to add
I'll
one.
give you the floor
Yeah.
in just a second. I just wanted to ask you about your UFO experience and what you saw.
Oh, mine. Wow. Okay. I was going to add on to Michael's because I didn't know if we were going to go to a different point, because what I wanted to add to Michael's is that I think if you're an honest person and you experience something, I think you are skeptical because you owe it to yourself to get to the bottom of what exactly you saw, not to trick yourself. So I do believe some people that I know personally myself that witnessed something are skeptical because they won't accept BS. They'll accept the true answer to it, and I'm willing to be wrong about what it is.
Well, I just wanted
usually...
Oh, I'm sorry to interrupt. Go ahead.
No, Rachel, go ahead.
Brian, I saw you raised your hand when.
Yeah,
when
I did.
Yeah. Could you tell us about your UFO experience?
I've said this a bunch, so I've got the speech ready, and it's what brought me here today. So, like my first playthrough in ufology is basically going through all the greatest hits, right? And then coming back on the whole like let's figure out what really went down type of thing, which is actually more fascinating than actually seeing weird stuff. But anyway, my experience was I was 12. My dad was outside with the dog, and he called. He goes, "Hey, check this outside," and then we looked, and it was a bright kind of phosphorus light. I wouldn't say it was like a flare because it wasn't like dripping anything, but it was kind of white and shimmery. And then it stood there for like maybe 10 minutes in the air. It was quite bright. And then my twin brother came out. So there's three of us now looking at this. And then at a moment's notice, it turned deep, deep red. And then it started kind of going backwards and forwards in the sky in really odd manner. And I can't tell because of depth perception if it was getting bigger or smaller or farther away or whatever. It was moving odd. And that went on for about 30 minutes until it just kind of went off into the distance and was gone. And that was it. It was mundane, but it scared me. And it also just kind of set me off on like, what the heck was that? I'm going to go to the weirdo section of the library everywhere I go, and which I still do today because I still love the stories. I still love hearing it. I love hearing experiencer stories, even though my critical thinking skills have changed a bit. But that was it. Thank you for asking. I'll add one more thing too. I think Michael's like, as soon as you tell your story, I think it loses 90% of its weight as well because it's really important to you. And then when you tell it to someone else, you're like, that sounds really stupid telling someone else that. You weren't there. You weren't there. You didn't see it, and you weren't scared. And it just sounds like, well, it's a flare. Obviously, well, it'd be very easy to dismiss something like that.
I don't want to take up much time with this, but let me say that the experience that I had, that if my wife had not been with me, if there weren't both of us having this experience, I wouldn't be talking about it. It's the kind of thing I would not be discussing if it was just me. If I was the one who looked up there and saw what I saw and there was no corroboration, I would probably go back and have a couple drinks and forget about it. All right. But no, this was my wife and me. And being a newspaper man, I was aware of the problem of story generation. So I said to her at the time, we were in a car, let's not talk about this. We went home. I said, I'm going in here, you're going in there. We're going to write down exactly what we saw. We did not discuss it. This is my point. We did not discuss it. You write, I'll write what I saw, you saw what you saw, write what you saw. So maybe a half an hour later, we get together and we compare. Yeah, whatever it was, we saw the same thing. But it was a black triangle in 1979, 78, 79 or 80, I forget. But I had the time it was the size of my fist at the length of my arm in the sky. So it was sizable thing. All right. And it was, anyway, but coming out of a journalistic background, I'm skeptical almost by baptism. I'm also used to the fact that people see all kinds of interesting things all the time. And that includes many people that we would have no reason to conclude other than that they're sane and responsible and, ordinary folk. Ordinary folk, it has been my experience, there's a lot more goes on than they ever talk about. And it isn't only UFOs, it's ghosts, it's whatever, the whole range of paranormalia, all right? There's a lot more going on of that than people talk about. That was interesting to learn. But I came at this from the skeptical point of view, and I took the various steps that one would do at the time to try to find out what's going on. I was in touch with the airports. And of course, what the airports really love is when a newspaper person calls up and asks them about UFOs in the skies. Airports just live for those phone calls. I'm being highly sarcastic here, but I got cooperation. I did all of that and then just dropped it because there was no place to go. I was told about MUFON, and I went to a meeting of MUFON, and that was it. That one meeting is all I had to attend, and I wasn't going back there. All right. It's well, I don't mean to beat up MUFON, but I think you all know what I mean, and especially James knows what I mean.
Yeah.
Yeah. But where do you go? There's no place to go because there was no internet, there was no nothing. it was show up and meet these bunch of people, and half of them were kind of dubious. And so I split. But even now on Twitter, on X, on Blue Sky, when we get into discussions or disagreements, I'm almost invariably on the side of the skeptics. I'm almost invariably standing with skeptics, except that I can only go so far because of that sighting.
Yeah. Yeah.
It's very isolating to be literally in the middle of this situation, where, as I said, it's the believers. I have a religion. I don't need your religion. Thank you. All right. And then the debunkers who, as a radical, militant debunkers. It's crap on both sides.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
it reminds me like I think two people that have really influenced my thinking about the para-weird and UFOs and stuff like that are David Hufford and Eddie Bullard. And
Eddie Bullard.
I've heard both of them make very similar statements about this, because they'll be like, at a conference or something, and they'll be like, hey, I'm on your side. But people won't believe them because they're approaching it from a scientific, using scientific methods, and that looks like debunking to a lot of people, which but I agree with you, Michael.
Well, we don't need no damn science. I mean,
There you
that's
go.
we've been showing that the last, for a few years now. We don't need no damn science. This is America.
Right. Right. So, those of you that haven't shared yet, would you like to express some observations or counter arguments? Randy.
Yeah, so I had a question for James. First off, so I haven't read your books yet. I did read the paper that you submitted, and I love the fact that you submitted this to a journal for peer review, and like you're out there, you're walking the walk and getting feedback from this. So can you share what feedback did you get from that peer review process?
Well, the peer review process itself is basically, for them to review the data and how you analyze your data and whether the analysis is sound. So that's the peer part of it. As far as actual feedback from the community, crickets, which I find very interesting.
I read through it. There was a part in there we were talking about doing letter frequency analysis of the 1947 flying saucer articles. And you pointed out the spikes in the occurrences of the J and Z letters, and even after you removed the word June and July. What about the word object? Seems like that's a word that would appear numerous times in these articles, and could that account for the unusual J occurrences?
I'd have to go back and actually search for that specific word. I don't know how frequent object was. I think there was the label back then was either flying disc or flying saucer, or I don't know. It wasn't UFO. It wasn't UAP, and I'm not even sure object was that frequent.
Saucer.
Yeah, saucer was the most frequent, or disc. Disc spelled D-I-S-C or D-I-S-K. There were a couple of different variations of the spelling.
Okay. That was just the one word that jumped out at me. And then you talked about the not doing the bigram and trigram analysis. And I guess I didn't understand why that wouldn't still be useful if we're just looking at the flying saucer articles to determine if there was gardening or not. Like, this is before any translations to Russian have occurred. Seems like that sort of analysis would still be useful. Is that true?
To an extent, I didn't think it was useful from the point of view that, we don't know. I don't know. And we can't even figure out from the Venona translations exactly how these messages were sent back and forth. Whether or not they took the English newspaper verbatim and sent it in English and let it be translated on the other end, or the originator first translated it, then put it in the encrypted message translated. We can't even establish that because the NSA does not release the original telegrams, right? So they're just releasing what they were able to decode. And so I didn't know if that was going to be useful because I would first have to translate all of the entire corpus I've had into Russian and then try to do analysis on it. And I thought, well, is my translation going to be sufficient? Or how did someone back then translate it? How much of the article was actually incorporated into the encrypted communication? How do I know that they didn't take a 30 sentence article and actually, put it down to 3 sentences? I didn't know. So that's why I didn't think it was actually useful, because I didn't know what the original corpus of material was.
Okay.
Good questions, Randy. Along those lines, Nick Redfern once shared with me, and it's in the book I've shared with you guys, a State Department cable from that era where the American Moscow Embassy sent an article about flying saucers to the U.S. State Department. And a couple of points, it does show that, the United States was monitoring the Soviet media and what they were saying about saucers and whatnot. But also, as you mentioned earlier, James, they basically just packed it up in a pouch and said, here's an article, check it out. It didn't require an emergency cable, as you were talking about earlier. So these are interesting points. I had wondered too, I was speculating to myself, like Randy's bringing up, about that could make the value of proper nouns all the more important, that it would minimize the mix-ups in translations of words like flying saucer or crash and things like that. If, as you pointed out in your work, the name Kenneth is repetitive, for instance.
Yeah. And even if, let's hypothetically say the guardian operation was reality, it was true. One, it's not documented anywhere, right? So I have to give my critics that, right? There's nowhere in the literature where it's documented. But then as I was speaking with a professor from Florida State University, who's a specialist in deception operations, she said, nothing post-World War II deception is known. That's the whole point. We know a lot now about what happened during World War II with deception operations. We know zero about what happened after the war. And that's because, and we know because we have documentation to this effect, that the US government is purposely restricting historians' ability to document that. It's like when the historians try to come out, wanted to write the whole story of D-Day, they were forbidden from talking about strategic deception. Tactical deception, yes. Strategic deception, no. That was censored. So we know zero about what the US has been up to with strategic deception in post-World War II. We know zero.
Another point that certainly Moscow must have been aware that at the very point we're talking about here, the United States was hell-bent for leather to produce the hydrogen bomb. All right, this is, if we're talking 46, 47, and we're starting to get into the 50s, I mean, we already were masters of the universe and having the atom bomb, but we were going to have the bomb of all bombs. And I'm sure the Russians knew this. And I'm sure that our folks knew that the Russians knew this. And so I think that this does absolutely create an environment for gardening. I think this really strength the continued development of thermonuclear weapons, in this case the hydrogen bomb, it's just fits right into the timing narrative with this.
Yeah, so, I think that Project SEAL point is a really important data point there. Yeah. Rachel, did you have another question?
Yeah, there was a couple of points that I just wanted to bring up, I like I said before, I do find your stuff really compelling, and so me critiquing it is not meant as, any form of disrespect or something like that. But I had a question about this from your paper here, where you're basically comparing the AI generated articles. You generated like 10,000 articles using AI, is that right? And then you got the gardened on the left, or no, let's see, what is it? Yeah, the gardened on the left, and then the ungardened in the middle, and then you got the actual articles that you gathered. And I found it really strange that the not gardened has more anomalies than the gardened. But I think another question I have is, how useful would an AI generated text be? Because, like looking at how AI generated texts generally are, like they don't really mimic style very well in my experience, and they don't they tend to be anomalous in a way in themselves. They don't correspond to texts that humans write, because they have certain patterns in them that human texts don't have. So I'm kind of wondering, wouldn't it be much more useful to actually use a human generated corpus for comparison to actually see what the rate of anomalies are?
I just realized when you show me that image that that version of the paper you have is pre-peer review.
Okay. So you didn't use that evidence in the
that was not
paper?
used. Yeah, that's not in the paper.
Oh,
So
okay.
sorry, Jack, I probably said okay to send that, not realizing you had an earlier edition or earlier draft of it. Because what
No
happened is,
worries. I was happy to be able to share it.
no, because it's a good point. You're making a very good point, Rachel, because as part of the review process, one of the things that was pointed out was, well, we think AI generated text is probably not the way to go. You should use a human corpus. And so I changed it to a human corpus. So if you look at the final article, it does have a human corpus in there.
Oh, good. Okay. Yeah. Well, the other main thing, because I have to say this, I just feel ethically obligated to point out that AI, it's not free from the physical world. There's a whole infrastructure that goes into AI generation, which consumes massive amounts of power. The amounts of power it consumes is increasing at an exponential rate. So there's just massive amounts of water consumption, carbon emissions, massive amounts of just land to deal with this. And there's a recent report which I'm gonna post in the chat from the United Nations that goes over a lot of this, but this is not like anything new. There's been a lot of research over this over the past few
You don't
years.
have to tell me because I live in Data Center Alley up here in Northern Virginia. They're building a data center just down the road from me that is absolutely massive, like absolutely massive. So yeah, and it's all because of the AI. It's all AI driven.
Yeah. So I just wanted to point that out.
No,
I protest
it's
AI also takes away from, like using AI media, I think really takes money from artists, and someone who comes from an artistic background, I find I find it upsetting. That's all. No disrespect.
I agree with you, but I also think it's a great tool, especially when you're dealing with a large amount of information, like I've been gathering over the last 20 years in my research, right, from archives, from MUFON, from all these different data sources. And it's overwhelming information, and just trying to correlate it. That's why it took me 10 years to write the Roswell Deception, because just trying to correlate the information in a way that I could make it sound believable, or it could flow properly. It was just an enormous job. And now what I'm finding is that I can tell AI, for example, like Claude, Anthropic's Claude, here's my data. I want you to spend your time and analyze it and come back and tell me what you think about X. And it does an amazing job of analysis. It would take me way too much time to try to do it on my own.
Yeah, well, I mean, I see where you're coming from, but I don't actually think that its usefulness outweighs the impact on the
Oh, no,
environment.
no, I agree. I
So
agree.
we
Yeah.
might have to agree to disagree, I
No, no,
think.
no. I actually I agree with you on that.
Okay.
You're right.
Yeah, you're talking about
I-
the ethics. You're talking about the
Yeah.
ethics of owning a genie, basically, right? Like
Well, no,
you have.
what I'm saying is that science should be conducted in an ethical manner, and if it's not being conducted in an ethical manner, I don't think it should be, being done. And you can always find alternate methods. And unfortunately, I didn't look this up, so I don't have a source for it. But my understanding is that, in fact, it's the AI language models that are actually using the most energy, not like, image generation or something like that.
Interesting. I didn't know that. Yeah.
Thank you, Rachel. Any of you that haven't shared yet, do you have any observations, questions, opinions?
I really enjoy your theory um as far as the Roswell release goes. It's always been such a hard thing to put a finger on because once you reach the point where you assume that it was a release that was done purposefully for some type of intelligence reasons, right? Because it certainly couldn't have been a mistake. Whereas a general put out a release all on his own without getting prior clearance, and then suddenly went and pulled it back and said it was a balloon because he got it, the hammer came down on him or something. That doesn't seem to be very likely. Like you had mentioned, that there was certainly other people involved. The message had to be approved from the top down, both of them. So I think that your theory, as far as the gardening and the exploitation of the event, is really interesting. And you back it up with some really good, solid, substantiated research too. So I just wanted to thank you. I think it's really interesting.
Yeah, and I wanted to thank you too, because I do find your work very compelling, and I don't mean to be personally, I'm not like trying to attack you or anything. I know I'm coming off as a little adversarial, and I'm sorry about that.
No. You have nothing to
No, no,
apologize for, folks. I mean, truly, this is healthy debate, right? This is what we should be doing. If somebody comes up with a theory, you should debate it. You should point out what you think are fallacies or incorrect assumptions, or maybe look at it from a different perspective. All super healthy. It's when no one wants to debate you that is an issue.
Yeah.
So the crickets
This is that
from
I
the
agree.
UFO
I agree.
side and the crickets I hear from the Cold War historians, that's infuriating, because it's basically invalidating all of the efforts and research I put into it, because they're not willing to even read and even entertain the fact there may be an alternative hypothesis behind this.
Yeah, this is something I came up with a while back, is dissent is respect, If you're not dissenting, you're not being respectful.
James, let me ask you really quickly, since we see what's happening with the disclosure group, and I'm sitting back and watching Luna, who's the big champion for disclosure, bringing in people from Russia and giving them a tour of, the state capitol. And she, and obviously a lot of the people in the new disclosure movement are they're promoting, obviously misinformation, disinformation, propaganda. Seems to be pretty common for Russia to engage in that types of behavior. How do you see the current disclosure movement with regard to foreign intelligence kind of playing into it?
That's a really good question, because I thought long and hard, what the hell is behind the disclosure movement? Why are they pushing this so hard? And it's not even like, oh yeah, there may be aliens and we have to watch our skies, and so let's put out better instrumentation to detect the unknown objects, and because of flight safety or whatever. It's they're regurgitating all of the stuff from ufology, that from the last 80 plus years, that we know a lot of it is myth. Whether it's crash retrievals or it's alien bodies, they're basically trying to put a stamp of truth on that without any basis in fact, without any release in documentation. And then it's like they're playing. I kind of equate it to like if you ever go to one of those Civil War reenactments where they battle each other in the different uniforms, and then they get together for lunch afterwards to talk about the good times. I think that's what we're seeing here. We're seeing like the disclosure movement on one side, pushing all of this UFO myth. And then when you call them on it, like, okay, where's the truth? Where's the documentation? Where's the evidence? Where are the bodies? Where are the crash retrievals? Oh, well, there's this thing called the legacy program, and those guys are trying to prevent us from releasing all of this information. And so it's like they have this ready excuse for why they don't have to explain what the bullshit that they're pushing out. And for the life of me, I don't understand why they're doing that. Whether there's a foreign intelligence purpose to it, or whether it's just, misinformation, disinformation, social manipulation. I don't know. But
James, do you think it's lobbying? Do you think they're lobbying?
Lobbying for what?
Do you think their advocation is a form of lobbying to use laws in a way that in one front is trying to get access to technology that wears a UFO t-shirt but could be used to set up contracts? I have my tinfoil hat on, but I just wonder what you think about that theory. Because I think they're lobbying. I think they're pushing to manipulate public opinion, to put pressure on the government to reveal secrets. But by legislating, they opened the door to tech transfer to our Peter Thiels or Elon Musk and whatnot. What do you think about that?
Well, we'd have to know who they are first to know whether there's a lobby. Because from what I can see, all of this that's culminated into the disclosure movement of today has been carefully choreographed over the last, let's say, 9 years since the New York Times article came out.
Yeah.
Careful choreography to get to this.
And James,
yeah.
James, would you agree, and would folks agree that one of the things that we are definitely looking at since 2017 is the fact that the DoD and the IC have assumed control of the narrative? They had succeeded. You don't agree?
No, I absolutely agree. They've hijacked the narrative away from ufologists.
Right.
They own
Right.
they own the narrative.
That's exactly right, and it's absolutely crazy. In the sense that the spooks that we were supposed to distrust 30 years ago are now our heroes.
Mm-hmm.
All right, and it's just absolutely amazing. And I don't think I'm have much of a paranoid streak, but as I've seen what's happened, the minute I saw that story on page one of the New York Times, I said something is wrong. Something has got to be wrong here. That not only is this out, it's now page one in the New York Times. Like what? Because having, as I said, worked in the newspaper business, there are a definite list of taboo subjects that you never have to tell anything about. Reporters don't want to hear about UFOs, apparitions of the Virgin Mary, or any of the whole weird angle in life. And no one's going to ask about that stuff. And the Times had been quite uncooperative in shedding any light on the UFO question until all of a sudden, boom. And then the way everything has unrolled, it really makes me suspect that there's a plan here, and there always has been. And the extent to which one would ask Leslie Kean or Chris Mellon or any of these people, like, what do you know about that? I mean, I don't know if they know what they know about that.
Yeah,
but
honestly, I don't think
yeah.
I'm not sure about Mellon, but I would say Kane, she's just being used.
Yeah.
Like George Knapp is being used, like Corbell
Well,
is being used.
Yeah, but if George Knapp and Leslie are being used, maybe Chris is in the position of the user.
Could be. Yeah, I can't say.
And also our comedy team is absolutely perfect PR. You have Mellon for the suit crowd, for the politicians, for the so-called serious unquote people. And then you've got Lou Elizondo for the bros.
Mhm.
You've got everybody with this team. Right.
And
So
that's
if
why
you're
I
not
said it's well
listening,
choreographed, very well
yeah,
choreographed.
right. If they're not listening to Chris Mellon, they are listening to Lou. And if they're not listening to Lou, they're listening to Chris Mellon. It's just it just all seems too convenient.
Yes, it
That's correct.
does.
Mhm.
Let's cover, if we may, one more data point I'd like to get to. Thank you all for your insightful and interesting comments.
Jack, can I add something?
Please do, Sharon.
Please.
I think there's a very simple answer, and it's the same answer that's been, if you pinpoint what happened in 2016. Okay, we've got Donald Trump as the president. And since then, Jack, Allison, and I, now Rachel, cover this, study this information, that degrading a shared truth, it gives rise to a strong man. It makes people say, I give up. I don't even know what's true. It's all, throw it all away. All of it's useless. I'm just going to go to take my kid to soccer practice, forget about it all. And anytime you see these, I'm not even sure what's the point of all this. Why is Anna Polona, I can't remember her name, Luna, why is she doing this? You can always go back to it's to degrade the confidence in our institutions and shared reality, because confused people are easier to control. It's been used time and time again in other countries that have fallen to dictatorial leaders. And it's no question that Russia has wanted to do this to us. And that's the answer.
Yeah, what's the saying that propaganda is not designed to convince you of a lie, but make you doubt everything?
Yeah. Gary Kasparov.
I would agree. I would agree with what's being discussed here to an extent, except this whole disclosure thing is the most bipartisan issue that exists today. So if we can say, oh, we want to bring a strong leader. Well, the strong leader is on one side of the aisle. Let's be honest.
But let me just say, I just got to push back on that a little bit.
Yeah, that's not how it works.
The people that are actually on board with the disclosure movement are, some of them are quite vested in crypto, which we know happen to be, it's like Gillibrand, I mean, and Moskowitz and people like that. So I question their motivations.
Yeah, you have to throw out left, right. You have to get out of that frame, because if you're stuck in the left, right, you're in a hole. It's not a left, right.
No, and I'm not calling it a left, right. I'm saying that it is bipartisan, that both sides, the left and the right, seem to agree that disclosure is a good thing.
It's interesting.
That's what I'm saying.
Definitely some motivation. Money,
yeah, then you have
behind,
to, like what Eric is saying, then you have to drill down to who, and then you got to look at their bank accounts.
But true, we could look at the money angle in that, but I think that what I want everybody to really think carefully about is how small this group of disclosure advocates is, how tight it is, and how well choreographed it is. And a lot of them are the usual suspects that have been around a long time that seem to be used to push disinformation and misinformation on the UFO side, starting with George Knapp, going all the way back to Skinwalker Ranch, going all the way back to Bob Lazar and before. So and I think that's part of my motivation for putting out this 12-part series, because that's what I'm building up to. I want to start way back when with the airships, go through World War II, go through the 50s, talk about those threat of deception into the 60s and the 70s, and then all the way into the 80s with Bob Lazar. And now we're into the 90s with Skinwalker Ranch. And lo and behold, now we have this disclosure movement. And there's one long thread that you can actually weave in there with the same people.
You left out the abduction craze. That
Oh,
fits it. Yeah.
There's the abduction craze, yeah, and there's of course the the bogus MJ-12 documents and all of
Yeah.
that other stuff that's part of this mythology. But there's a common thread, and it always seems to be the same people are involved.
Yep.
And that's what gets me. That's what makes me think that this is more than just strongman tactics or crypto schemes. That there's something behind this, and we don't know what it is. I can't say I know what it is. Maybe it truly is a disclosure, but a disclosure for an entire different reason. I mean, maybe at some point they're going to fess up. There was a gardening operation in 1947, and by the way, we used the free press for that. Sorry, we know that a democracy shouldn't be doing that, but they have this whole envelope, right, where they sort of dressed up the whole alien thing. So to basically say, maybe we can push out this truth that we're really embarrassed about, but it's really going to be, people are going to be like, oh, well, that's just low on the totem pole compared to all this other stuff that you've been releasing. I don't know the rationale behind it, but I do know that it's just too convenient, too choreographed with the same people that makes me really suspect as to what is truly behind it.
I mean, I think there is a thread, but I think, my concern is, again, going back to my comment at the beginning, is that I don't think it's as unified as you sometimes make it sound. Like, I mean, like you're talking about airships, and there's
No.
let me finish.
Yeah,
Like the Phantom, there's the Phantom plane. This incident or a series of incidents in Utah in 1916 that are very interesting because they feature a lot of the things, a lot of the kinds of intrigue and stuff like that you see later on during the UFO era and stuff like that. Like, so I think that you're right that there is like a real thread there. And a lot of these people that were involved in 1947 were drawing off of cultural information that we're just not aware of today. But I don't think it's like it's all just like this one orchestration, like it all has, like this singular structure, but it's connected by, movements and groups of people, like.
Yeah, I agree. Yeah, we're saying the same thing. I think what I'm saying is there is no deep state out there that's been orchestrating deception since the airships in 1800s up until now. There is no it's this ultra secret organization that's behind it, almost like a reverse Men in Black thing. I don't think that exists. I think what I mean by the common thread of deception is that the subject itself is being used for purposes of deception, and different groups for different reasons at different times tug on that thread when it's convenient for them.
Absolutely. Yeah, I agree.
Yeah, like let's go back. I want to try to fit this in if we can, please. You had mentioned, James, that you look at circumstances today and you just go, what the hell is going on? I can understand how someone relatively new to the subject might look at July 1947 and feel that way too. That these major sightings were reported within days of each other, and there would not be just the two events, not sightings, Roswell and Arnold. There would be a third if they hadn't gotten caught, Maury Island. There would be a third. They just got caught. And so we've looked at some data points, the Project SEAL deception, the FBI memos of people's names being inserted into report narratives. We've looked at the memo about United Press boosting a story and its significance. We've looked at a number of data points. Let's look at one more. So after Kenneth Arnold got encouraged by a stranger that said, yeah, those old boys in Washington, they're straight arrows, go up there and talk to them. He flew up there, and let's just talk a little bit, please, about the oddities that happened when he got to Washington, and circumstances that must be accounted for one hypothesis or another to be validated. And like you alluded to earlier, the circumstances at his hotel, for instance.
Yeah, that's a really interesting story. So for those who don't know, when Arnold got the offer from Ray Palmer to go up to Tacoma to interview the Maury Island witnesses, and he was hesitant, finally got convinced. He actually gives two different accounts of how he got convinced. One was the guy that walked up to him at the Boise Ad Club and vouched for Crisman and Dahl. The second one, which he actually talked about in his book, The Coming of the Saucers, was his friend Dave Johnson from the Boise Statesman, who convinced him to go to Tacoma and to take Palmer up on his offer. Those were the two influences. So when he finally decided to go, he gets up one morning, he has his private plane, he doesn't tell anybody except for his wife that he's going to Tacoma. He jumps in the air, he lands at La Grande for a brief stop, and while he's in La Grande, he calls up Dave Johnson from the Boise Statesman and says, hey, I'm on my way to Tacoma. This guy, Dave Johnson, which I think really I need to spend more time looking into his background because he seems to be more of the agent of influence in this whole operation. So only person who knows besides Kenneth Arnold's wife that he's going to Tacoma is Johnson. When he gets to Tacoma, guess what? He doesn't have a place to stay, right? He just did this on a lark and got up and got in his plane and went. He started calling around only to find out that all the hotels in town were booked. He's like, damn, where am I going to spend the night tonight? So he finally decided to call the largest hotel in Tacoma, which was the Winthrop. And when he called, the guy answered and said, oh, yes, by the way, Kenneth, Mr. Arnold, we have your room ready for you. Think about that. How did Kenneth Arnold get a room reservation that he did not make under his name? And the only person besides his wife who knew he was going there was this Dave Johnson guy. So he said, well, what the hell? Maybe there was another Kenneth Arnold that made the reservation and I just lucked out tonight. So he went anyway to the hotel. He got the key to the room 502. And then he called Crisman and Dahl. He actually also called E.J. Smith, which was a United Airlines pilot that had his own sighting. And they had met previously, Arnold and Smith. So he called him to help him with the investigation. Dahl and Crisman come to the room to tell their Maury Island story about what happened on June 21st, that they were out in the harbor. The strange object came down and rained all of this metal debris onto their boat and killed the dog and injured the Dahl's son. This whole thing that's the Maury Island myth. And they brought fragments of the alleged craft with them. So Arnold is like, oh, okay, well, this is an interesting story. But then what happens is that he gets a call from a reporter, which just happens to be Paul Lantz from the Tacoma Times, who says, hey, I just got a call from an anonymous caller telling me you guys are having a meeting about flying saucers in your room. And this freaked Arnold out. He's like, well, what the hell? Who's leaking this information? Is my room bugged? What's going on? So what he does is he calls Hamilton Field, Arnold does, and talks to the two Army Air Force officers who had previously interviewed him and say, hey, you guys told me if anything weird goes on with flying saucers to call you. This is happening now. This is crazy. They get in their B-25. They immediately fly up to Tacoma. They get in the room. They interview Dahl. They interview Crisman, who all are starting to recant their story all of a sudden because they have real Army Air Force intelligence officers interviewing them. And then they take some of the fragments that Dahl and Crisman brought, and they say, hey, guys, we're sorry, but we have to leave now because the next day is Army Air Force Day. Remember, Army Air Force was established August 1st, 1947. We have to go back, or the Air Force, I should say, and then we have to get back to Hamilton Field tonight. They put the fragments on the plane, they get in the air, 30 minutes, they crash and they're dead. And what happens is the next day after that, after the B-25 crashed, this anonymous caller starts calling around to the United Press, to the Tacoma Times, and starts saying, hey, we know the identity of these officers even before the Air Force released it. This B-25 was shot down. It didn't crash on its own accord. They were flying saucer. They were injecting all of these weird elements into the story that was then making it into the newspaper. So it seemed like there was this true media art angle behind it, even to the point where the anonymous caller told the reporter, I think it was Ted Morello, he said, make sure this information gets back to New Jersey. Like the anonymous caller was trying to inject the story into the press to get all the way back to the East Coast, which makes no sense whatsoever, unless there's some weird, strained operation going on. And, so this is what Maury Island's about. All of these oddities, all of these strange events and these strange occurrences that, if you talk to a ufologist about it, they're like, it was the Men in Black, which happens actually to be the first Men in Black story that came about with Dahl's encounter with some man who told him to shut up and not talk about Maury Island. That was the birth certificate of the Men in Black. But you can't look at all those oddities and say there's nothing there. There's got to be something there. Who made this reservation for Arnold, right? When he didn't make it? Why is David Johnson, the guy who knew about it, that he was coming there, why was he sending a telegram to Hamilton Field to the same two Air Force officers and saying, hey, Ray Palmer from Venture Press gave Arnold $200 to investigate flying saucers. Maybe you should check out Venture Press. That sounds more Cold War operation to me, right? More like there's some ulterior motive to what Raymond Palmer is doing here. It doesn't sound like paranormal. It doesn't sound extraterrestrial. It sounds very mundane, and it sounds very much like an intelligence operation.
Thank you. And yes, I see a lot of overlap there with the circumstances covered in my book and the NICAP story. And we can't always identify why things happen the way they did, but it seems apparent to me that there are circumstances that are obstructed and need to be clarified in order for a hypothesis to work. Any comments, counter arguments, questions?
Yeah, I'll put my debunker cap back on, I guess. But yeah, these are definitely things that I think deserve attention and should be resolved. The only thing is I've always, you can ascribe to these things. It's possible that some of the people that are involved with the story could be the reason that they happen, right? The hotel room, it's possible that Johnson could have got the hotel room, or even possibly Chrisman could have done a lot of these things. Calling the newspaper, calling Arnold, or should I say, letting people know what the conversation was inside the hotel room. It is plausible that these people, could have done it, and that it wasn't some type of government op, so to speak, right?
No, you're absolutely right. In fact, if you read the FBI memorandum behind this, so all 20 pages of it, that was their conclusion. Their conclusion was more than likely the anonymous caller was Chrisman himself. So as the investigative body looking into that and documenting all this, that's the conclusion they came to. Very mundane. But they also documented something else, which is astounding to me, which was the Ernie Vogel, who was the guy that was, I think he was with the Associated Press. And he went to interview Dahl before Arnold did, because the Seattle Post-Intelligencer said, hey, these guys from the harbor told the story, go check it out. So he went to Dahl's house. As soon as he walks in the door, Dahl's wife is there in a rage, telling her husband, tell the reporter everything you're about to say is not true. You're making it up. Right? And so Vogel goes back, and what does he do? He tells the Seattle Post-Intelligencer, this is a hoax. The guy's a mental case. We're not going to print this in the newspaper. It's not going to happen. Right? I investigated it. There's nothing there. Then all of a sudden, he gets pressure from the Boise Statesman, 500 miles away, the same newspaper that David Johnson works for. Pressure to put out the story, even though it's a hoax. Why is this newspaper 500 miles away getting a Associated Press newswire man? Why are they putting all that pressure on him to release the story instead of just putting it in the paper themselves? They read a paper. Why didn't they just print it? Why are they trying to put the pressure on the wire guy? Unless the pressure was to get it to originate through the newswires, right? To give it some sort of credence from outside, right? Yeah. Those are things that are absolutely weird and strange that the FBI has documented. So yes, you're right. In all of this, it's a hoax. That's correct. But there's also pieces to it that can't just be explained as a hoax. And those are the parts that I still hang on to.
Thank you,
Yeah,
James.
next time we'll have to get into British security control and how they planted rumors at multiple locations to make it appear that they were corroborated from multiple sources.
And I do want to say one last thing here, Jack, which is back then in this time frame. I mean, I know I'm going to date myself here, but you know the old cartoon Scooby-Doo, right?
Yeah.
Well, guess who was the Scooby-Doo gang back then? It was the FBI. They're the ones that did the investigation. They documented, and if there was a true intelligence operation, they would have gotten away with it if it wasn't for these damn meddling kids, which were the FBI.
FBI has become my go-to organization for FOIA requests. I've learned more about the CIA from FBI FOIA requests than what the CIA will release in their FOIA requests. Yeah. But who would like to comment? Final comments, questions, statements?
I have one last question. James, what needs to happen, or how do you continue your research and on gardening? Does it have to go beyond the UFO subject, or is there some kind of, you're basically saying there's no such thing as smoking guns? So how do you carry on what you're doing and iterate?
Yeah, I think for me to continue this line of research, first I have to get back to the National Archives, because I'm sure there's thousands of documents that have since been declassified that could shed more light on this, especially around the deception operation, joint security control. And also, if the NSA has released anything that had to do with the Venona project, probably have to also get to the UK archives, because they also have a ton of information there that they were gathering at the same time. So I think in order to, and I'll obviously keep track of what the Department of War is releasing too, right? Because they're releasing more documents each day. But it really gets down to finding original documents and doing original research that's not guided. And what I mean not guided, I mean not like Stanton Friedman and Bill Moore, who were sent to the National Archives to try to find an MJ-12 document that somebody planted there, right? Nobody's guiding me in this research. It's me going out there and me picking the data sources I think that would be relevant. And if they're declassified, great, then they may shed more light on this.
Anyone else? Going once.
Do you have anything to say, Jeff?
Just enjoying the conversation. Listen to all you. You got Brian and Steve now. You don't need me anymore. They've got all the good points.
Thanks for being here, Jeff. We appreciate all of your participation.
And
I finally beat you to him this
everybody,
time, Jeff.
and I want to tell everybody, I really appreciate you guys being here. You know, I don't feel any disrespect or any, feel like you guys are just trying to debunk me. You guys are asking the good questions. You're asking the critical thinking questions that are so important. So thank you for putting your critical thinking hats on and joining this debate, because this is what we truly need, right? I don't have the truth. I'm not the source of all truth. I don't know if my hypothesis is valid or not. I need to hear this feedback, right? To know, hey, maybe you're barking up the wrong tree. Maybe you're wrong in this area. This is all so valuable. It's so great. So I really appreciate it. Thank you.
Thank you. Yes, thank you so much for joining us. Anyone else with a closing thought?
Yeah, thank you, James, and thank you for discussing it. And as you illuminate and touch on other points, you really do. Again, you substantiate what you're saying and bring to the table, and I really appreciate that. I hope that you're here again soon.
Thank you. Yeah, I'd like to be here.
I find the whole topic of gardening and everything you talked about just to be incredibly fascinating. I look forward to reading the books that you've written. And then I guess my last question is the data sets that you compiled and used in the paper that you had reviewed, are those publicly available anywhere?
They are, yeah. And I'll see if I can get the actual article, resend it to the group so you can see what those data sets are.
All right, thank you so much.
That would be wonderful. Thank you.
Sure. And Michael, I'm very jealous that you met Ted Morello.
What you were talking about the Venona papers. One of these days I'll tell you the story about how I showed up at a party in New York City and found myself being introduced to Alger Hiss.
Really?
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah. Well, that was not a long conversation. All right. But that's as I said, if you're in the news business, you meet all kinds of people, and sometimes it's
I
surprising.
can imagine.
Alger Hiss, again, we're talking ancient history. Is all over the Venona papers. The Venona papers absolutely clinch the deal, at least in my mind and in most people's mind, that yes, Alger Hiss was a conscious spy for the Soviet Union during the entire period he worked for the U.S. government.
And it nails the coffin on the Rosenbergs too.
Yeah, too. Yeah, I know. Yeah, but Cold War, things were so much easier back then.
Again, thank you all. Thank you, Erica, for joining us.
I'm so happy to be here. And I like I said, I geek out on this every time. And I love hearing all the feedback. And James, like you were saying, it's so nice to have a place where people are talking and having rational conversations and important, dialogue. We need that in the UFO community, but we also need that all over the country right at the moment. But
Yes,
I value everybody here, and it's really fun for me to be here.
I think we need a counter UFO conference, like a get together of like-minded people like us that, spend a couple of days together and just, really go over this and get folks that are like-minded that, involved. That would be fun.
It
Well,
would.
we could take a tour out to Skinwalker Ranch.
Oh yeah.
I'll be the tour guide.
Oh,
Salt Lake.
Sign me right up.
Okay.
Yeah, me too.
And thanks to all of you for listening and watching at home. Visit us at expandingfrontiersresearch.org. Browse our Patreon account for more resources, videos, interviews, articles, and follow us on Blue Sky, links to which you will find in the YouTube show description. And this has been another episode of Wayward Sons Book Group. Thank you.
Thanks, James.